Ellen Johnson Sirleaf was born in Monrovia, Liberia, a country formed in the 1800s by formerly enslaved people sent from the United States to Africa. But tragically, having survived that unthinkable brutality, they built a nation that repeated some of the same patterns of dominance. A small Americo-Liberian elite of the formerly enslaved came to rule over the massive indigenous majority, which set the stage for generations of conflict into which Ellen would step. Now, her father was the first Liberian of indigenous descent elected to the national legislature, and her mother was a Methodist pastor who taught her that faith was not a performance but a responsibility. Faith is what we do for people. As you can imagine, her home life was complex, marked by privilege and pain and possibility. So Ellen married when she was 17, but when the marriage became violent, she made the difficult decision to leave to protect herself and her 4 sons. She went back to school and studied economics and public policy. And she learned how nations rise and how they collapse. And she learned what corruption does and how greed manufactures poverty. Armed with that knowledge, she decided to speak out against the military dictatorship of Samuel Doe, and she was arrested. But when that didn't silence her, she was arrested again and eventually threatened with execution. And it was only because of international pressure that she survived. She fled into exile, first to Kenya and then to the United States, where life was stable and safe. But exile could not satisfy a conscience shaped by responsibility. And Methodist churches abroad helped her stay rooted in her faith. From a distance, she watched Liberia fall into a horrible civil war, and she knew she had to return and leave comfort behind. And after the first civil war, she returned to absolute ruins. With 250,000 dead of 3 million, 1 million displaced, and among the worst atrocities you may recall, 20,000 children had been forced to become soldiers. 20,000 children. And many who fled chose never to go back. But she did because she believed her nation could be repaired. And later, she became the first democratically elected female president in the history of Africa. And for her leadership, she received the Nobel Peace Prize in 2011. Hers is not a story of triumph alone. It's a model of strength and moral courage shaped by faith. Because faith had taught her that love does not run away from those who suffer. The reason I brought her up is that there were echoes of this story from Zechariah. So he was born in exile, far away from Jerusalem, among a people who had been forced from their land by Babylonian armies that completely destroyed the city. But by the time he was born, exile had become normal. As people had built houses, planted vineyards. They even found comfort there. And so when the chance to return home came, not everyone wanted to go or chose to. But Zechariah's family chose differently. They were from a priestly line and believed their calling still belonged in Jerusalem, even if Jerusalem no longer looked like home. And as you know, what they found when they arrived was the temple in a heap of stones. The economy had collapsed, and those who stayed had stayed through famine and fear and felt forgotten by those who returned from Babylon carrying with them significant means and influence, and suspicion grew between them. And when things became too hard, many went back to Babylon. But Zechariah stayed because he believed God still had a future for the people. The nation could be rebuilt. And yet, The future doesn't build itself, does it? So Zechariah gave the people a vision they could hold plainly as day. A time when the elderly would sit safely in the streets and children would play without fear. That's how he defined a healed society. It wasn't because of wealth or power or their religious observance. No, a society measured not only by their safety, but their joy in living. And here's where I see Zechariah's story meeting ours. As I hear more and more people asking, should they give up and leave our country? Somewhere else to raise our children, or a place to enjoy growing old. And I sympathize. I sympathize, because it is heartbreaking to watch people feel the need to harden their hearts in order to survive their breaking hearts. But the story of faith has never been an escape story. God doesn't call people to abandon the world, but to love it. Empires will always manufacture distractions to hide greed and corruption. And there will always be a place that looks like a greener pasture. But are we called to pursue comfort? Are we called to escape? I think we're called to faithfulness where we are. And faithfulness is like stubborn love. I'm going to love you regardless. There are daily decisions to do what is right, even when no one notices. I remember this story earlier in a local paper about two neighbors who had barely spoken since 2020. One was Carol, who lived alone in a white farmhouse with a rainbow flag in her window, and across the road, Ron, who flew a red MAGA flag on his porch, and they kept their distance. And then one morning, heavy rain turned their road into a river. And as water began to seep into her basement, Carol looked up and saw Ron crossing the road with his work boots, carrying a shovel. And he didn't knock. He just started digging a trench to divert the water from her house. And then asked to come inside to help her move boxes to higher ground. And when she thanked him, he brushed her off, said, "You'd have done the same thing for me." And something changed that day. The next day, he waved at her as he drove by. And she left a plate of cookies on the porch. And as the paper reported, they still disagree about nearly everything. But they stop pretending they're not neighbors. And actions like these may seem microscopically small in the face of enormous power, but small matters. Small does not mean meaningless. And that's actually what the exiles needed to hear when they returned to Jerusalem and began to build the temple again. The foundation they laid looked so small, so plain, so unimpressive that some of the elders who remembered the temple from their childhood wept when they saw it. This was not the future they dreamed of, and they mistook small for failure. That same ache of doing good work that feels too small to matter runs through our nation now as we watch the government shutdown drag on. Painful to watch families and children stand in long lines at food banks while wrecking balls prepare the ground for a gleaming new gold-plated ballroom. And while park rangers and air traffic controllers and food inspectors labor unpaid to keep others safe, ICE is handing out signing bonuses. Empire never stopping its funding of fear, rewarding detention centers but not senior centers. And you heard Zechariah use the image of elders in the streets at safe, children at play in the plazas. That's how you measure a people's health. But today, the old wonder what to do when their Medicaid shrinks, and the young practice active shooter drills that steal from their recess time. And by that measure, we fail Zechariah's vision. Feeling despair about this is honest, but it is a strategy. Because when people give up, nothing changes, and when people stay silent, cruelty wins by default. So hear me, small work matters. Showing up matters. Feeding people matters. And every act of that stubborn love and a whispered prayer is a declaration of hope. And into this moment, the prophet Zechariah gives a word directly from the mouth of God: do not despise the day of small beginnings. Small things are a sign that God is present. So in September, we started a new lunch and activity program for seniors every Wednesday. And on the first day, we prepared for 40 guests and worried, what would we do if we ran out of food? And far fewer than that showed up. And we felt discouraged, but we knew we had work to do to invite more. And yet, little changed for weeks. And I started imagining how to give up gracefully, let it go as a good experiment. And perhaps wondering if it was worth their time, our volunteers remained committed. And then I witnessed a shift, and it was the one I dreamed of. There's a sizable Mandarin-speaking community at Green Manor that exists somewhat unto themselves, unable to communicate, separate from our neighbors, separate. And I wanted to bridge the gap of all the residents at Green Manor and our church and our neighborhood. And I finally watched it happen organically as participants and volunteers made arts and crafts together and showed them to each other, proud of their creations. And week after week, the greeting between the group has grown as the smiles and the affection can be seen, and more community members have joined in. And last week, we had a total of 24 guests and volunteers. Carolyn came the first day and saw how few. And a man was asked if they serve any food at Green Manor, and he said no. But with a big smile, he said, I get to come here every Wednesday. Small things matter. We're not the first people to wrestle with disappointment and discouragement and despair. And on All Saints' Day, we honor those whose faith was not proven by how loudly they believed, but by how deeply they loved. Not to be perfect, but to be faithful. Not to run from the world, but to help repair it. Because love does not run away. And Ellen Johnson Sirleaf was not a saint in the sentimental way people sometimes imagine saints. And she was not a perfect leader. Her story included some questionable choices and painful consequences, which is precisely why her life matters so much. She didn't return to Liberia for triumph. She returned out of responsibility, shaped by a faith that taught her that leadership is service. And now at age 86, she is still serving the world. And asked how she kept going in the face of such enormous need. Raised in the church, she spoke of prayer and purpose and trust that God does not call people away from struggle, but through it. And so like Zechariah, she did not leave when hope was small. And sustained by God's love, she gave witness that God has never run away. God has never run away from us. No, the love of God entered human history and refused to leave. The love of God entered the world in flesh and blood and walked straight into suffering. The love of God blessed the bleeding and healed the ones left to die. The love of God touched the sick no one else would touch and defied the holiness that labeled them unclean. The love of God overturned the tables that traded faith for control. The love of God marched truth into the palaces of power and exposed their lies. The love of God tore down the golden altars of greed and false glory. The love of God defied the whips of empire and shamed mobs who cheered them on. The love of God carried a cross through the streets of cruelty and did not turn away from death. And then the love of God rose, not to claim a throne, but to break the grip of fear forever. And so when the world turns hard, we will stay human, right? When the world turns hard, we will stay human, right? And when fear tempts us to flee, we will stay and do the hard work of love, right? Because love does not run away, right? Amen. And so we now remember the saints of our church who have died since last All Saints' Day. And first we have Billie Jean Neal. Billie was born and raised in Texas and became a dental assistant and then met her Navy aviator husband, Clarence, in Corpus Christi. And they married in 1943 and then moved around the country to various naval postings, ending up in San Diego. She and Clarence had 3 children, Tom, Richard, and Kathy, and they joined Mission Hills UCC in 1970 and served on the church council in the late 70s. And it was just 3 years ago that we all celebrated her 100th birthday with party after worship. And Dorothy Stock grew up in Connecticut, where she became a secretary in the early 60s and moved to San Diego and began working at San Diego State College, which is now SDSU. And while working there, she would look out the window and watch the track team practicing and decided she'd like to try that too. So in her early 30s, she began running. And a running coach saw her practicing and offered to coach her to become a competitive runner. And she did indeed become a competitive runner and won medals as she competed around the world. She married her coach in 1975. She was also proud of being a regular blood donor, achieving the 10-gallon level, which is approximately 80 donations. Dorothy came from our founding church, First Congregational Church, and when the two merged in the 70s, she became a member here and passed away at age 92. Melinda Murphy was a native of San Diego. She worked as a labor and delivery nurse for many years. She and her husband Bob were married in 1986, and during the 90s, they and their 3 sons moved around the country several times, settling for the longest period of time in Dublin, Ohio, where Melinda became active in the church and started a lunch program that continues to this day, developing many lifelong friendships. And when their sons were no longer at home, Bob and Melinda returned to San Diego and moved into Mission Hills in 2015 and joined here a year later. Melinda was especially active with the Membership and Growth Ministry, leading her group to win this Golden Spoon at the 2018 Super Bowl. And most recently, Susan Shuren. Born into a family of medical doctors, Susan followed in their footsteps, becoming a pediatric oncologist. She married a fellow physician, and they had 2 sons, Jonathan and Daniel. Susan served for many years as the director of pediatric oncology at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, and in 2006 moved to the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute in Washington, D.C., where she became a prominent national researcher and clinician. She retired in 2014 and moved to San Diego to be near her son, Jonathan, and his family. And having been a long-term UCC member, She soon became active here at Mission Hills and even served on my search committee and spent several years as the head of the personnel committee. But her greatest joy was being a grandmother to her 2 grandchildren, Olivia and Daniel. For their lives and for their faithfulness to the Church of Jesus Christ, we offer our thanks. We also remember many of us have been touched by the death of a loved one in this past year, and we've received some names, but I know there are many others we carry on our heart this morning. Beginning with Bill Summer, who was Dave Summer's brother, and Edward Lonsdale, who was Mary Lonsdale Baker's brother. Mark Taliaferro, who was Joan Barry's uncle. Carolyn Bamberg, who was Keely Bamberg's mother. Jose Quinones, Elizabeth's father. Luis Peña, cousin, and Cristina Hernandez and Esperanza Soto, friends of Elizabeth Quinones. Michael Fowler, who was a friend of Kristen Brown. Joan Mangan, Pam McGregor, and Mike Davis, who are friends of Jerry McInerney. Christina Schlesinger, Jeff Burton, and Keith Jones, friends of Carol and Larry Holt. Dr. Dwight Erickson and Richard Scheffler, friends of Kathy Schwartz. Marla McBride's friend Robert Dutton. Jay Sivdahl, Beverly Berry, and Rosemary Zuschmidt, and many more. If you'd like to call out their names, those you remember today, whether from this past year or at any point in your formative life, call them out. Let's light a candle in memory and hope